Kennedy is also known for some of his dalliances with ladies, most famously with Marilyn Monroe, with whom he engaged in an ongoing affair throughout much of his presidency. And thus, when we think of Kennedy, we don't really think of a president much concerned with the issue of gender equality. And yet, almost by accident, Kennedy did have an impact on the growing women's movement in this country. He recognized that it was certainly a cause getting an increased amount of attention. And so while he might not have been a great supporter of women's equality in his own right, he did recognize the political value of this cause. And so he created something called the President's Commission on the Status of Women in 1961. And he appointed to chair that committee a woman that we are all familiar with and who is much known for her many contributions, and that was Eleanor Roosevelt, still alive and kicking, and still very much invested in her many causes. She took this work incredibly seriously, and when Eleanor Roosevelt and the committee published their report in October of 1963, it was one of a number of different publications that helped to spark the women's movement at that time. And so in this almost accidental way, Kennedy contributed to the women's movement that, in fact, he didn't really care too much to support openly. In terms of civil rights, Kennedy's record is also somewhat mixed, and we'll be talking much more about the civil rights movement a bit later in the lecture. But one of the things we need to understand about Kennedy is that he was certainly a supporter of civil rights. He was very popular with African Americans. He won a huge majority of the black vote in the presidential election. And he spoke very eloquently about equality for blacks and that sort of thing. But political realities limited how much Kennedy felt he was able to act on these beliefs. If you glance back at the electoral map from his election in 1960, note that much of Kennedy's support in that election came from the South, and Kennedy was concerned that if he came out too openly and too vigorously in support of racial equality, that he would not win re-election. And so, as we will discuss later, it's really under Lyndon Johnson, a bit later in the 60s, that we see the strongest action in terms of civil rights. But Kennedy did support it. And there are a few examples during his presidency when the chips are down. Kennedy does come down in favor of the civil rights activists. One of those examples comes in September of 1962, when James Meredith, who you see pictured there on the right, was attempting to become the first black student at the University of Mississippi. And of course, Mississippi, perhaps the most intensely racist state in the Union. And so this was certainly an action that drew enormous attention. And when Meredith attempted to attend the university, huge mobs of vicious and angry white people came out to stop him. And so Robert Kennedy actually sent federal marshals, and you see the picture on the right of James Meredith being accompanied by federal marshals to protect him on his way to the university. The mob actually attacked this group, and 2 of the marshals were killed. And so John F. Kennedy responded by sending 30,000 Army regulars to the scene and having the Army escort James Meredith to the university for a time. There are a few other instances, and we'll talk about some a bit later, when John F. Kennedy came out openly in support of the civil rights movement. But as I mentioned, for the most part, his presidency is marked more by rhetoric, more by speeches about civil rights, and not so much by action. It is perhaps for his assassination that Kennedy's presidency is best known. In November of 1963, Kennedy went to Dallas for the first stages of campaigning for his re-election in 1964. We have to remind ourselves that Kennedy doesn't know he isn't going to make it to the election in 1964, and so he was thinking about re-election. As his motorcade wound its way through the streets in Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald crept into the window there at the book depository building and fired several shots. Kennedy was hit twice, once in the head and once through the throat, and he died within a half an hour. And you see there on the right a couple of pictures, one just before and one just after the fatal shots. His assassination marked the end of an era, as I mentioned briefly a few moments ago. It seems after his assassination, the nation really slips into the chaotic and, in many instances, violent years of the 60s, the so-called days of rage. News reports ran 24 hours a day after his assassination. We really have the beginning of the 24-hour news cycle. His assassin, named Lee Harvey Oswald, 2 days after the assassination, was himself shot and killed at point-blank range by Jack Ruby, who stepped out of the crowd while Oswald was being transported and fired shots into Oswald. The nation saw this assassination live on television, and so it also goes down as one of those incredible moments. We can only imagine the sense of kind of fear and bewilderment that people of the generation watching this on television must have experienced. And I'm sure you all know that for people of that era and that generation, the assassination of Kennedy is one of those moments that everyone remembers where they were, what they were doing as those things transpired. With the death of Lee Harvey Oswald, the only person who knew exactly why he had acted and what he was doing was now dead. And so with the death of Oswald, Kennedy's assassination became mired in mystery and conspiracy theories that abound even to this day. There are dozens and dozens of books written about Kennedy's assassination, and there may be an equal number of documentaries that you can watch on television. And they present an array of different theories. Kennedy had a number of rivals or even enemies, from participants in the CIA to the mob to Fidel Castro to Lyndon Johnson, and there are many other sort of tangled elements of this web of potential conspiracy. I've watched a number of these documentaries, and the latest theories seem to be that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, but there continue to be a persistent number of unanswered questions about this. In some ways, it is the assassination that remains the greatest legacy of Kennedy's presidency. It means that his vision went unfulfilled. It means that we must forever ask the question, what would have been? What might have happened if Kennedy had survived? What might our fate have been in Vietnam? How would the Cold War have turned out? And all of these other sorts of questions. If you look at the rankings of the presidents, which again, these are sort of informal rankings, but there's usually a consensus. Kennedy is sort of in the middle of the pack. He's in the mid-20-ish range of our presidents. And I think in our mind's eye, we think of Kennedy as much higher than that or much better than that. But we have to measure him on what he did and what he was able to achieve rather than on what he might have achieved had he survived. And so in many ways, it is his early death, his assassination, that remains the great legacy of his presidency. If you Google the assassination of JFK, an astonishing array of websites with all manner and myriad of different theories and ideas will immediately pop up. And the screen you see here is just one sample from that, and I'm not even exactly sure what is being suggested on this screen, but it seems to suggest that Lee Harvey Oswald was actually standing in a doorway as Kennedy's motorcade went by, and not in the window of the book depository building firing the fatal shots. So I would invite you to explore this topic more if you're interested in it. It is a topic that has fascinated historians and fascinated American citizens from that moment to today, but for the purposes of our course, this is all we have time to explore.